Yeah. My talk today is about the movie industry, and I feel like you're almost at level of movie production here.
Okay, we'll have to leave that in the video now. Okay, I'm trying to edit that out. But now that I got roasted, I'll have to leave that in. Cool. Well, we are back for the first in-person pro seminar in a year and a half. So, yay. I've been looking forward to this. Yeah.
We have masks on.
That's fun. We have these funny computers here. So, yeah, so we're hoping to get this. So here's 3 more doctoral students sneaking in.
There's a video record of this.
Yeah. Okay. So we know who's late. That will appear on YouTube. Fortunately, they have masks on, so nobody will recognize them. Okay. So our guest today for the pro seminar is Bryan Stroby. Bryan is, as you know, he's an assistant professor at London Business School. He was a graduate of our very own Purdue University as an undergraduate. He earned degrees in both electrical engineering and English. He studied economics at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology before earning his PhD at University of Maryland. So please join me in welcoming Bryan. Oh, well, thank you for being here. And for being our guinea pig in this kind of hybrid format where we're recording and live. So, you know, I love to start out these interviews by asking how people got into this profession, because it's an odd profession. You know, I've never known a 10-year-old who says, I want to be a strategy professor when I grow up. So I assume that most people have kind of an indirect path into the profession. So what was yours?
Yeah. So I would say fairly young, I saw the appeal of being an academic. So I kind of had this on my radar for a while, but it took some exploration before I got to a place where I said, you know, a strategy PhD seems like a reasonable thing to do. You know, obviously at my time at Purdue, I was still kind of primarily on this engineering path. I was interested in research. You know, I think like a number of people I met in the field, I was exposed to kind of doctoral dissertations and ideas through some family members. So my grandfather, who was actually a 1952 Purdue ag grad, went back mid-career with a family and 4 kids, relocated them all to Missouri and got his PhD in his early 40s. And so it's always this idea like, okay, you know, this is actually something that's kind of fun and worthwhile to do. And he's actually, I'm staying with him on this trip to the U.S. right now down in Crawford County, Indiana. He has a beef cattle operation there.
Okay.
I'm still involved with, but very much from an academic side. So I was always kind of interested in.
He's got very smart cows.
Very smart cows, yeah, very optimized grass-fed Charolais cattle. And my father then was a PhD chemist and he worked at FDA for a while. And so when I was young, he actually got his MBA and transitioned into an academic career at a smaller liberal arts university. And so growing up, I was kind of around that environment. I thought, yeah, this is really kind of an exciting thing. So when I got to Purdue, and actually when I walked in this room, there's a bit of deja vu. I'm pretty certain I took intermediate microeconomics in one of, if not this classroom, in one of the classrooms along this hallway. It's identical layout. I think it was a few down, but I definitely took an econ class in one of these rooms here. I had this technical interest, but I wasn't quite sure, you know, what I was gonna do with that. So when I was here at Purdue, I did some towards the end, I did some undergraduate research in the biomedical engineering, so some lab stuff, and I spent a summer doing some kind of nano fabrication stuff at Notre Dame, and through that I kind of realized, this is probably not the career path I want to pursue. It's not going to be a PhD in kind of engineering. And during that process, I kind of actually realized that fairly early on. I thought, can I do something while I'm here? I really had a great experience at Purdue. That's very different than microprocessors or linear circuits and the kind of class I was taking. And so that's how I got into this. Started hanging out at the English department and got this BA in English. But then at the end, I was kind of deciding what to do. And Purdue had just set my sophomore year. Purdue had set up an exchange program with Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and I was kind of the guinea pig from the Purdue side to participate in that. And I think kind of it just really piqued my interest in I was taking I think signals and systems and advanced C programs. So there were kind of like engineering classes along with some Chinese language and things. But it kind of opened me up like, oh wow, there's this whole interesting aspect of like economic development and commerce that I hadn't kind of global business particularly that I hadn't really considered. I grew up in southern Indiana and I traveled some, but this is kind of had a big impression. So when I came back to Purdue, I thought, maybe after I graduate, if I'm not going to do something technical, maybe I can do something something international. So I had a friend from Shanghai who said, you should look at some of these programs in Hong Kong. They're kind of applied, semi-applied master's programs. Some people would go on to PhDs, but that's why I learned about HKUSD, and I did this master's degree there, and then through contacts that I had. So through that, I kind of realized, I'm probably not going to do a PhD in econ either. But I still was kind of interested in research and eventually doing something academic. So I went back through contacts I'd made at, I think when people ask about Purdue for undergraduate education, I always tell them like one of the just amazing strengths is the kind of connections they had with, or the kind of focus they had on kind of implementation and practitioners. So I had some very good interviews and things that actually continued even while I was in Hong Kong with companies here. And so I ended up working for a consulting company for a couple of years in Evanston, Illinois, so just north of Chicago. And during that time, the traditional kind of path there would be people would apply to MBAs. And so I started exploring, okay, well, there's also these PhD programs in business schools, and what do those look like? Might there be some kind of interest? But I was much less kind of formally prepared for that path than I think probably most PhD students, definitely most PhD students today. But even at the time, I didn't really know what I read some econ journal articles and things through the master's program, but I didn't really know what strategy was or these kind of things. And so when I was applying, but I looked at kind of a huge range of schools. I wasn't even sure it quite is a strategy program for me, and through that, I ended up at Maryland, where there was a very diverse faculty of people with PhDs in history, people with PhDs in political science, with very kind of interdisciplinary, all kind of interested in organizations and management, entrepreneurship, and so I ended up being a great fit. And so that's how I kind of got into it. I already had kind of a vague target, I would say, but I think one takeaway. Obviously everyone here is already in the profession, but for people thinking about it, I don't think you have to have a formal. There's no kind of one background. One thing I think is really valuable about our field compared to others potentially is that you can have a lot of different backgrounds, and every kind of unique resource configuration at the individual level can lead to some type of unique career trajectory. Kind of once you start a PhD program.
So true.
Yeah.
Pardon me for 1 minute.
Yeah, sure.
I'm picking up a lot of glare on my mask.
My talk today is about the movie industry, and I feel like you're almost at level of movie production here.
Okay, we'll have to leave that in the video now. Okay, I'm trying to edit that out. But now that I got roasted, I'll have to leave that in. Yeah. So why was there a particular reason why you wanted to Maryland specifically?
It was largely when I was looking at programs, I thought, this is there were people working on a really wide range of topics, and I was not in any way the kind of PhD student who could come in and say, okay, here's what I'm working on. here's the stuff I'm going to draw on. I mean, I kind of spent years working through that, and you see some PhD students that come in with working papers or even they kind of
maybe you see that a lot.
You see people. I mean, I don't know if that's average, but I meet some people like, wow, you really kind of already gotten deep. I think there's something to be said for I mean, in some sense, the PhD program is designed to put you through that process. So I don't think there's no. I'm sure running these pro seminars, people have already realized, there's no kind of right or wrong way to do this career by any stretch of the imagination, I think. And so, so Maryland was just very, very attractive in the sense that, okay, there were a number of people working kind of broadly on stuff that I was interested in. And at that time, I had kind of been in this consulting role for a couple of years, and I was very interested in kind of microfinance as a phenomenon. And so I ended up Washington D.C. was also kind of Greater Washington D.C. was also a very nice setting, and there were people who were very encouraging of kind of non-traditional stuff. So my first summer, actually, I went down to one of these microfinance institutions and kind of worked as some kind of data intern, unpaid for the summer to get some kind of view on how things were actually working, and that didn't turn into a formal project, but there's a lot of support for doing those kind of things. So it ended up being a great place to kind of figure out what I wanted to do as an academic.
So I think a lot of doctoral students go through that figuring it out process, right? So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about what that figuring it out process was like for you, and just maybe first, just remind us what your dissertation topic was, and then tell us, how it was that you stumbled upon that particular topic.
Yeah. So my topic was, it wasn't kind of extending a particular theory or a particular avenue. It was a little bit broader in the sense that I was looking at this kind of idea of heterogeneous, and we'll see this in the paper today, kind of heterogeneous motives in market. So on the audience side, when do people, and at this point I hadn't kind of formalized the thinking. I think it's part of this process is, when do people, when you have people in the same marketplace maybe agree or disagree, or behave in a certain way, but maybe for conflicting reasons, and the kind of consequences of those reasons. And so it's very much kind of like a social process kind of parent-driven thing. And it really just came out of, I came into Maryland, and maybe first semester I took a research seminar that I think phenomenologically I thought I would be very interested in. And then theoretically at that time I thought, this is not actually, I wasn't quite as excited about it. Now I think it's maybe more interesting. So I said, maybe the best course is to just kind of start something. And there were a lot of paths at Maryland. I mean, people were very supportive of kind of different paths. If you wanted to go kind of the apprentice route, there were people willing to advise. If you wanted to kind of try to push something on your own, there were people willing, with more hands-off people willing to advise. And so I started a working paper that ended up kind of becoming the motivation for the rest of the dissertation stuff, looking at these kind of motives on a nonprofit kind of peer-to-peer charity microfinance lending platform. And that got me very interested. So that was kind of a data-driven. It was kind of questions about, you have and more's been written about it since then, but there's this kind of microfinance industry that was kind of hybrid in some sense, combining elements of charities and elements of for-profit institutions, kind of banks historically, but they were kind of functioning simultaneously. And so I was very interested in, and okay, what does that look like for how fast people get funded? And at that time, crowdfunding was still kind of new. So it's kind of, I think going through this process of figuring out, okay, who's interested in that kind of work and where to place it. But that became like a dissertation. That became like the kind of the empirical motivator for what came later. And like I was saying, people were very encouraging of doing non-traditional stuff. So my second or third year, I kind of come with this idea, maybe there's some interesting stuff happening in microfinance. I have this I've been to China. I've been doing some language stuff before. I thought it would be neat to go do a project there. So I applied for, with full kind of support from the department. I applied for a Fulbright grant. I kind of went to China for a year, and that was really kind of just like on the ground exploring. I would like conferences to talk to people and meet people, and then that kind of started to piece together. I would say even I don't technically remember when I defended my proposal. I assume it was at it was almost certainly even after that. So,
Mhm.
so I met with companies. I was also exploring, and maybe talk more about kind of career strategy stuff later. But I was very interested in field experiment methodology, and something I think I ended up not doing it. I haven't done a ton with yet. It's something I'm so interested in. But at the time, I was talking to a lot of companies, attempting to run field experiments, putting it on AOM symposium, which is a great,
Right.
mechanism for PhD students to kind of get at the forefront of so Nick Bloom had come and presented his work from home study, and I said, oh, this is like amazing. I love to do stuff. So I just like wrote him and wrote some other people and had a little symposium on field experiments, and that was probably 2012 or something like that. And so I spent a lot of time like kind of exploring these type of avenues and really enjoying it. And so that's kind of then I kind of started to thread together. Okay, what's the common theme between these? And the other chapter came to be about motives for discrimination. That paper changed a lot over the years, but it was really okay. You can have multiple people respond to the same information in different ways, or you can even have the same person respond to that same information for different reasons. And these things kind of have consequences for markets or for organizations, and
Right.
slowly piecing that stuff together. So it's very organic. It wasn't kind of, and I would say a little more externally driven in terms of the exploration process than sitting down and saying, here's the gap. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do it, but that was kind of the process I went through.
Oh, wow. So tell us maybe a little bit, what would you say were the biggest challenges that you faced in doing this dissertation?
Yeah, I think, there's pros and cons to this, to every approach. And, looking back, I think it was, if you start a project out of kind of a general motivation, it's often a little, or kind of pursuing some kind of phenomena-based question. I think at the time I didn't appreciate how important it is to have a question eventually at some point. It doesn't have to come that early, but at some point a question that people can easily understand how it fits into. And I think this comes, we call it framing a lot, but it comes to represent something I think more substantial than I kind of realized at the time. And so I think there are probably opportunities to start that process earlier. And then the flip side is you might not, if you start that process too early, I think you kind of limit there's a potential to limit yourself, right? So there's I don't know if it's necessarily a mistake, but I think there's kind of costs and benefits. And even recently as a junior faculty, I think I've kind of discovered the value of some of these templates people in the field have created for just thinking about research questions and research problems. People like Will Mitchell,
right,
or as Zuckerman, who have these kind of genres of paper or templates for introductions that just force you, even if you don't write papers that way, they force you to think about, okay, why am I interested in this myself? Why might other people be interested? How am I going to translate that to communicate it to other people? So I think as doctoral students, it can be valuable to take those a little more seriously maybe than I had at the time. That there is kind of a structure, there is kind of a social structure around this field, whether it's efficient or not, almost doesn't matter. It's like a social process that has kind of evolved and is useful to some extent. And so to understand that and play around with yourself, I think can be valuable. So that's one. The other is, I think there are kind of two paths. One where you can kind of work on stuff on your own and try to get feedback from others, or you kind of apprentice. And I think both are useful models. But if you do this model where you're kind of working on stuff more independently, I think it's just like, I didn't realize at the time that framing process and even the exploration process is, there's some low hanging fruit to expedite that and make sure you're not just totally off in the woods by yourself. Right. And the trick there is to just kind of not overanalyze what you've done. So kind of practice honing down the big picture. You don't need to produce complete drafts of things to find to kind of understand where the challenges are going to be. You can kind of write down your thinking. So one thing I do now a lot is I'll produce like 1-page abstracts or 1-page intros and send them to colleagues, and colleagues will do this for me. And a lot of times this will help clarify thinking very, very quickly. So there's like a real skill to to asking for feedback and formulating the asks for that feedback, and also providing feedback. But I think for doctoral students, it's really like, well, providing feedback to each other, I think, is actually critical, because a lot of this can come from your doctoral colleagues. But you don't want to ask too early, but you also, I think me personally, I'm probably waiting too long to ask for feedback. So just like be aware of that. There's no need to like overcompensate for these kind of ideas, but be aware of that and kind of think about, okay, who can I ask for feedback? How can I ask them in a way that's efficient? And just iterate. And I'll do it now, or I'll write a one page, get someone's feedback, iterate it, right? So it's very minimal time coming from other people, but like the benefits can really be enormous in terms of advancing, early stage projects and ideas.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the first point you raised, there is a need to fit one's research into an ongoing conversation, right? And I think you raised an interesting point about, well, kind of at what point do you want to figure out how to do that? Because, if you do it very early in the process, then you're kind of pre-committing to what the study is going to be, and maybe the data tells you something different, right? Maybe the world doesn't turn out to be the way you think it is, and there could be a better story that you could tell, but if you're pre-committed to one story, you might not see it. On the other hand, if you wait too long to develop your framing, you get deep into the data and the setting, and let them guide you, then it may seem that whatever framing you put around it is kind of force fit, right? You're just kind of trying to take what you found and force it into some conversation. So I can see that there would be a trade-off there. Yeah.
And I think, I'm not a qualitative person, but some of the qualitative methodology speaks to this kind of directly. Like, how do you look at a situation, try to understand what's going on? I think there's kind of somewhat, there's been a shift even in the empirical side to say, okay, let's think about, okay, we see some pattern, how can we explain it, instead of kind of setting out a very clear question at the beginning, and the traditional method where you'd have a hypothesis and you kind of then get the data, then test hypothesis. I mean, so I think there's maybe increasing, I'm not the person to comment on this, but there's increasing flexibility maybe in the field that even if there wasn't one right way to do this in the past, that's probably even more true now. But it's, I think getting understanding how to get feedback and think about feedback, and independent of that question, independent of the actual research approach, you start with phenomena, start with these questions. I think it is something that is super useful for doctoral students to think about. And I would start with your doctoral colleagues. That's the best source for this kind of feedback in a doctoral program. Yeah.
Right. So I assume now that you're 6 years post dissertation, that you've kind of put the dissertation work behind you at this point. Is that fair to say? Or
no, I mean,
some of it's still hanging around.
Some of it's still hanging around. Yeah, this other thing you'll realize as a PhD student is that there's these projects you start now, and it's another reason to maybe not get too narrow too early in a doctoral program. It's like you should kind of be using doctoral program to explore what you want to be working on long term, rather than like what project you want to do during the dissertation. I think specifically, obviously, those hopefully overlapping.
Sure.
And also kind of realizing that the doctoral programs, I think there's kind of a range of activities you can do during a doctoral program, but don't lose sight of the fact that it's really an educational opportunity. I mean, you're getting an educational degree, so it's not. So yes, you're gonna hopefully be working on papers and this kind of output, but you're really like learning how to do research, and that learning is valuable as an end in itself. Like, hopefully you can use that later, but like you shouldn't. I think there's kind of conflicting views on what you should be spending your time as a doctoral student, but don't kind of overlook that learning this process and just exploring is part of the endeavor itself. So,
right. Fair enough. So some part of what you're doing now is new. It's post-dissertation new work. So
yes, that's right. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how you got from the work that you were doing in dissertation to the stuff that you're doing now, and what's the relationship, if any, between it.
Yeah, it's all kind of broadly around different types of heterogeneity, and I'll I'll step back even and say, it's kind of broadly around audience evaluation. So there's this kind of idea that, and it's kind of coming from OT and some sociology that candidates of some type, so that might be organizations, it might be people applying for jobs, it might be entrepreneurs developing,
Products.
doing pitches, it might be consumers, buying product. They're all being kind of evaluated in some way by some external audience.
Right.
And that audience might be consumers, it might be managers, it might be the media. There's all these kind of evaluations. Sometimes they're called social evaluations, sometimes they're called audience evaluations, but it's kind of broadly around this. And so in my dissertation, I was kind of interested, I hadn't formalized at that time, but I was kind of interested in this. There's these funders on lending platforms and microfinance who are evaluating things, and there's all these opportunities. I mean, there's kind of the traditional economic explanations for the characteristics of what's being evaluated and how people are going to respond, but from OT and a lot of sociology, there's all these kind of interesting social processes that happen. Things like status, I'll talk about in the paper today, but also things like discrimination, or things like a project I did since then was on allegations of misconduct against police officers. So there's all these situations where somebody does something, or somebody has a certain trait, and then others evaluate that in some way, and they have to kind of decide, is it A or is it B, or is it good or is it bad? And there's all kinds of interesting patterns that happen there. And so out of the dissertation, I kind of involved this interest in motives for discrimination, and why people might, and there's kind of some classic explanations, but there's also some environmental kind of moderators of these explanations. And that kind of got me into some of the projects I'm working on more recently. I think this thing on movies today, where the same audience might, there are people, within an audience, there might be significant heterogeneity in the evaluation of, say, the quality of a film, and this could have effects on performance for producers who make films, or people who behave in a certain way. And so that's how I slowly transitioned. And I'll say, some people have a very narrow theoretical thread, or phenomenologically based thread in terms of how they choose new projects. Mine's a little broader, but there's typically some type of audience that is making some evaluation, and there's something's potentially decoupling that evaluation from maybe true underlying quality, as you might call it, or some on these.
So one of my mentors, Jay Barney, likes to say that all research is deeply autobiographical, right? And the topics that we choose tell us something about ourselves. Why is it that you found it so interesting to study heterogeneous audience evaluations? What is it that you found really interesting in that topic? What made that interesting to you, heterogeneous audience evaluation?
Yeah. I mean, I think it started with this. Really, and I haven't continued narrowly in this line, but it started with this stuff on microfinance. That you have in charities and nonprofits more broadly, you have people who have kind of separated out these types of organizations, and they are willing to engage with it under certain conditions, maybe, but not others. And there are kind of maybe very different outcomes for how that, for those choices. And so, I wouldn't say, even when I was working as a consultant, I thought, it would be very interesting to work at one of those kind of companies who are apparently like these online lending platforms,
like Kiva.
Yeah. So this kind of empirical paper I started my first year in the doctoral program was using Kiva data. And what was interesting was just that there seemed to be a common platform with a set of entrepreneurs, and that varied. I mean, you looked at them and you thought, okay, this is like all these entrepreneurs are existing on a single platform, even though it seems like, okay, some are kind of your prototypical like bank investment. They talk about market returns, and they talk about doing market research to open this new branch. You think, okay, you can conceivably get this loan from a bank, and others are, talking about family issues, why they need this money. But they're existing so both valid reasons, but very different.
Right.
And they're kind of existing in the same space. So there must be something on the audience side that explains
Right.
this kind of support.
Right, or maybe it might be about their passion or about what this is going to do for their community.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, all these are valid, and all these are valid reasons to get money, but it's kind of interesting that they're existing simultaneously, like in a single market. And so that was kind of the impetus for this was just kind of better understanding how that happens. And I would say, in terms of just like coming up with ideas, a lot of ideas are just kind of spurred by kind of understanding. So that was like very personal phenomenon. Like I've been making some loans on Cuba. I saw these different borrowers, and I thought, oh, that's kind of these different entrepreneurs in there. I thought, okay, this is kind of interesting. Like, what could explain like how this works. In the paper today, there was a BBC headline talking about box office returns, and I thought, okay, and it said like, the BBC headline was literally like, the traditional narrative is that, these kind of movies do worse, but actually in this, recently they've done better. I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like, first, is that kind of empirical claim? I wonder what the conditions on that are, and then two, I think what's interesting with our field is that, it's not a hard science. There's all kinds of moderating conditions that can make one thing true in one situation and the opposite in another. And so I thought, that's, from my kind of understanding of the literature, that is like a little surprising. And there was literally like an article. So, where my co-author said, hey, I think there's some data where we actually kind of pursue this like a little bit further. So a lot of kind of new projects will come out of, extensive browsing of just like general media or financial media, where there's something kind of like occurring that seems interesting in a gut sense, and then you start applying some kind of analytic structure to say, okay, well, why do I think that's interesting? Well, it's because every one of the papers I read about topic X actually would predict something different, or just no one looked at this, and then you do have to. You have to be like a little cautious, and I think that's where it's valuable to take it to colleagues and say, hey, what do you, I think this is really interesting. If they say that's kind of boring, and then you need to do a little more due diligence maybe before you invest a ton of time. But at the same time, I think one value of this, one kind of benefit of this field is, you kind of hopefully develop the tool so, even if no one cares, you can spend an afternoon like trying to answer the question for yourself, and usually there's some seed of something there that I have a lot of kind of just 1 to 2 day projects where I thought, oh, this is kind of an interesting question. I'll sit down and work through this, and I'll show it to a couple of people, and maybe they're not, they don't think it's as cool as I did, and I'll moderate my investment in it, but you can kind of pursue these things to their just out of your own intellectual curiosity, and hopefully it feeds back into some bigger conversation, but you can't necessarily know that before you do a little bit of investment in the stuff. But I would say, particularly, I mean, it's a little more challenging as a doctoral student, but everybody showed up here to kind of showed up in this profession to kind of scratch their own itch, in some sense, explore something that they're kind of broadly interested. So you can kind of, I think, to some extent, trust your gut on exploring these kind of things. Obviously there is a structure to the profession that you need to merge things into eventually, but it is also valuable not to overthink it too much.
You're right about that. You piqued my interest when you mentioned that you actually funded some Kiva loans yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you 2 questions about that. Number 1, have you been paid back?
Yeah.
And number 2, do you care if you get paid back?
Yes. So this is I think in terms of just like curiosity, this is what got me interested in the platform in the first place. Was at least I haven't actively done much on Kiva recently.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of my dissertation, I actually went out and with somebody in marketing did some surveys with other people, of their lenders. But at the time that I was doing it, you would make a loan, but you wouldn't get interest on the loan, but you get your money back. And of course, there are a lot of channels. If you just want to give your money away, you could go give your money away. And there are a lot of channels where if you want to make some money, you can make money.
Exactly.
And somehow people end up in the middle. So that was kind of the initial thing. It's like, well, this is kind of puzzling. Like there must be something at the entrepreneur level, or maybe there could be something at entrepreneur level.
Right.
And then the second layer was, wow, there's like a lot of variance here. Like there's kind of the traditional entrepreneurs that you would ask for returns on, and the traditional entrepreneur, you might say, hey, look, this is really going to help the person out. You don't care about returns, but they're all kind of functioning under the same
Right.
policy
You
regime.
definitely have mixed motives from the
Yeah, yeah.
lenders, right? Because they're not going to make any money. On the other hand, they're not just giving away their money.
That's right. And my initial hypothesis around there was kind of, oh, maybe there's some kind of bimodal distribution, and there's like two types of lenders who will select different types of entrepreneurs. And, it turns out it seems to be some type of mix in terms of, everybody cares a little bit about both. So it's this kind of, at the market level, it's actually hybrid. It's like a new kind of thing that's maybe a little more stable than if you imagine two kind of competing mini markets, kind of functioning inside the same thing. But yeah, it really came out of, I would say, most of my projects have come out of some type of interest like that. Like I was, reading about something and thought, there's kind of a set of broad patterns I'd be interested just to start exploring, and then begin tying those back to bigger questions.
Right. So, okay, so your general topic area is heterogeneous audience evaluations, right? So what would you say are the most important unanswered questions in that topic area? What do we not know about heterogeneous audience evaluations? Sorry. What do we not know about heterogeneous audience evaluations that we really ought to know?
I think what has made this kind of such a useful resource kind of setting. I mean, I'll say what's made answering this kind of broad topic useful in recent years. That there's just like a lot of online activity. So Kiva, you see all the lenders who choose a certain loan.
Right.
You see
there's a lot of data.
There's a lot of data. And same thing you'll see on the movie project today, and peer-to-peer lending and these kind of settings, and even the police project came out of some media around the city of Chicago releasing these data. So before, you didn't know the set of the set of officers who were who had accusations against them. You just kind of knew if they actually had a lawsuit or something. And all of a sudden now you have the input of this. You have a bunch of evaluations of stuff that came out of nowhere, or not came out of nowhere, but that was released. It wasn't available before. So I think that's why it's an attractive setting. I think going forward, one kind of open question here is kind of what who is selecting into this. And I think it's quite clear. There's a lot of evaluations happening in context, in a given context, but there's also evaluations happening outside that context, to evaluate whether they should show up. And so in the case today, it's going to be like, obviously ratings of movies are interesting, but there are people who choose to rate movies, and there are people who choose to watch movies who choose to rate movies, and there's all this stuff that's still happening. And
so you're asking who shows up on the audience side, or who shows
on the
up
audience? I think on the audience side. So we see like the results of an evaluation. So we see an entrepreneur is funded or not, or we see what rating a movie gets. And I think there's some interesting questions around. I was talking with earlier in one-on-ones about who decides to rate. It's like interesting question.
Right.
Obviously, empirically, it's kind of difficult to answer, but there may be kind of motives related to that as well that influence what we see, and even holding that constant. I think there's a lot of stuff we can do currently, but there is this kind of larger question that I think people are starting to work on that will be increasingly exciting in the next medium term.
Interesting. Okay, very cool. So. Now, have you had much of a chance to work with doctoral students at London? No,
I'm not. I have not advised any at LBS. I've doctoral students are quite active, so I'll tell this to all the doctoral students. You should not hesitate to contact any faculty member at any time for feedback. So I've given feedback to quite a few on stuff that they work through their second year papers, but not in dissertation committees.
Okay, so often I ask our guests, what's the most important piece of advice that you've given to your doctoral students? I'm not sure if you maybe have enough experience with doctoral students to answer that or not, but if not, then maybe what's the most important piece of advice you received as a doctoral student? Flip it around the other way. Either one, pick one.
Yeah.
What's the most important piece of advice you've given to doctoral students or received as a doctoral student?
Yeah, I'd say it's both, and maybe I didn't realize that at the time, but there's a lot of people working on very diverse topics in this field, and so you might think your research aligns with somebody, or you might think it doesn't. But there's always some kind of commonality. So I would say just make it a priority to make sure that your colleagues, so people in the department, know what you're working on at any given time, because it'll kind of spur ideas, and this is something that again, you want to for all this kind of stuff, you want to minimize time investment required to do this. So even like 15-minute conversations over lunch or coffee, just to get feedback from people kind of early, but also so they know what you're working on, and they meet somebody else who's working on something similar. Say, oh yeah, there's some commonality here. I should introduce you. I think it's always a shame when somebody is working on something similar, you don't find out till later, or
Right.
You find out, even if they're not working on something similar, you find out they're working on something. Oh, that's really, you have some kind of, it triggers some innate interest in you, and you think, oh, I've known about this a couple of years ago, maybe I would have had some extended conversation with them. So it's very simple, but it's I would say just make sure that if that requires like scheduling a formal meeting with people, I would do that. But a lot of times this can kind of be informal, and I'm sure you've got these kind of pro seminars where people are presenting, and
Absolutely.
make sure you're doing that. And that's one thing that I think was such, he's probably comment on this too, but was such a strength of the program. I think for me personally at Maryland was that we were presenting every week. We had, I guess, an hour and a half presentation from a doctoral student every single week, and that was mostly to each other. But it was kind of like as soon as you came in from first semester, I guess, in the program, you would stand up and present for an hour and a half. And obviously, your first semester doctoral student is not presenting like a polished research program, but you're presenting ideas, and then you see, oh, okay, that person. They have some unique insight to some idea because they just came from working in some particular job, and that builds collaborations, just builds this feedback network I was talking about. So if you're not already presenting each other, I'd say do it every week. It doesn't have to be an hour and a half, but like a formal kind of accountable seminar. Yeah, the schedule that I think it really is
Something regular.
Yeah.
Good. Good. Well, let me, we have maybe a couple of minutes left, so let me just throw it open if anybody from the audience has any questions for our guest. Brave?
Yeah.
What are the possible options available when graduating? What factors make you choose a place kind of far away from you?
Yeah.
Okay, let me just repeat the question for the microphone. So Jing is asking, why did Bryan choose to go to London Business School over whatever other options he had available at the time?
Yeah, I think it's worth at the beginning of the process, you kind of sit down with your significant other and you kind of decide what's the scope of geographic, I would say, starting off. And for me, I grew up in the Midwest, so I was open to coming to the Midwest. I'd been living on the East Coast, I was open to the East Coast. I'd been in HHUSD earlier, so I think I applied to schools there well, and I never lived in Europe. I thought that could be fun. I talked to my significant other, and then just apply. So I think that's kind of the first thing is you just think yourself. Then you start thinking about characteristics of the department and things that you might want or not. And they're often, particularly at smaller departments, they're often kind of styles of research or kind of maybe there's a focus to what they're doing. And so it's worth thinking about, do I want more people doing things like me, or do I want people doing different things? How might this complement what I'm doing? And then I think that the big thing, or one of the big things, is thinking about like department culture, and you can kind of figure this out by asking people questions about. I think one of the good advice someone gave me is ask when you're depending what kind of culture you want. If you want a very active culture where people are kind of in the office every day, then you ask people who they had lunch with last. And if it was like a month ago, then it's probably not super active. If it was like yesterday, or they're about to leave for lunch with somebody right now, then you kind of get a sense for that. And so, I was lucky that I think, culturally, LBS is a very good fit. I like having lunch with people. So, we have lunch. Well, we did until mid-2019. Almost every day, a group having lunch together. And it's very much kind of a culture that fit with what I'm doing, and is useful for this getting feedback from people and these kind of informal chats. But I think everybody has a different priority in that. But I would as you get closer to the market and choosing, you just kind of split it up and think about, okay, you personally, what might you want to do, and your family, and then start thinking about departments, and your advisor will be even at that point. I think hopefully you'll start to have met people in the field, but your advisor can be quite useful in terms of giving you advice on, okay, there's some overlap here in the network of of PhDs that came before Purdue. I'm sure as part of this pro seminar you have alums come back, and that's another thing they did very well at Maryland. They have alum come back each year and kind of walk through that process as they experienced it the previous year. And you see, okay, this is how they made it. This is how they made those kind of decisions. But is that optimal for me? Maybe not, but you at least have some insights into how you might make those kind of decisions.
Great. Should we try to squeeze in one more question, or? Okay,
I can ask.
sure. Okay, we'll squeeze in one more question.
So you said you worked on microfinance, right? Or with microfinance stuff. What's one intuition you came away with from that book? If there's one thing you have to pick that you learned, what was that?
And so this is actually a good question to highlight different approaches to phenomena. So there were people and I always struggle with this a bit, because there are people who study microfinance and they look at microfinance institutions and they have some very good insights in terms of, does microfinance work? Does it not work? And it was a bit daunting at the time that I got into this, because, my interest was really on this Kiva project I started and became a dissertation chapter, was really in, okay, do people have different, are there kind of people with very different motives coexisting on this platform? Which is actually kind of a narrow question, not about microfinance per se. And once you get into this, particularly in Washington area, there are all kinds of people, World Bank and a bunch of microfinance institutions headquartered and care about more practical things to microfinance itself. So I would say, like, I never came away with a one overarching insight about microfinance itself, but I came away with these insights into these platform level policies. You could, will influence behavior on these kind of microfinance platforms, and it might influence it in ways that are aligned with the platform's goals, or it might influence it in ways that are not. And so that ties into this whole body on research on platform, and how you think about attracting people, what kind of people get attracted, how they behave once they get attracted. So that ended up being kind of more of the type of questions and answers I was working with on microfinance. But yeah, at the beginning, I was kind of overwhelmed by, there were people. I took in the Aggie department had a development econ class I took, and I thought, wow, there's all these people doing all this stuff. It seems so relevant. But in reality, I think that's the other thing I learned throughout the doctoral program is there's lots of people working on almost every topic in many different areas. Part of the doctoral program is really understanding, okay, what's unique to strategy, kind of broadly, or management and organizations. And there are people working on microfinance, I think, have a unique strategy or OT angle, and you see stuff in our journals. But for me, it was more of a setting to look at these other things on discrimination, or on social motives versus kind of profit motives versus or social motives, like in the Kiva case. And so that's where or social influence, these kind of things within these platforms. Yeah, so don't, I would say if you are kind of starting off a phenomenon for the doctoral students, it's good to branch out and see what other people are doing, but also not to get overwhelmed. I mean, I think in what I'll present here in a little bit, there are people in marketing who might care about this question, but I think that the angle and the DVs that we're looking at actually are unique to strategy. And there's a whole, this is like an important insight for strategy. So you don't have to, I think, particularly in the early stages, and I'll say, the same thing with this police paper I published last year. There's obviously whole fields of criminology. So you have to kind of start narrowing down, okay, given what's been done there, like, typically they're asking the questions in a slightly different way, or the outcomes they care about are slightly different, or the inputs they care about. What is it that can be done with, what can be done to contribute to this kind of management conversation? And for me, in I wasn't, the kind of work I was doing on microfinance wasn't going to produce an insight like microfinance is effective or not. I mean, there were, all these people at MIT, Jay Powell, and these kind of development econs who were really producing great work in that. It was going to be more something about individuals in markets or platforms.
Thanks. Well, thanks very much, Bryan, for
You're welcome.
participating.
Thanks for having me.
Participating in our little pro seminar talk show ritual. We really appreciate it. So please join me in thanking Bryan.
Thank you.